The boy sat alone in the dark cell. Geknosians in power armor and armed with coil guns stood guard beyond the durasteel bars. The boy lifted his head. A long, infected cut ran from the left side of his jaw, across his nose and to the right side of his forehead. The chains attached to the boy's wrists rattled as he reached yet again for the key just outside of his reach. One hand had been pierced through and through. Dark, almost black blood dripped sluggishly from the wound as the boy weakly strained against his chains. He'd won the duel. He'd earned his and his village's freedom weeks ago. But the monarch had imprisoned him anyway, for the murder of a superior being. The chains rattled again as the boy slumped back against the wall. His brow beaded with sweat as his fever peaked. He felt cold, so very cold, so very tired. The key was just an inch away from his fingertips. Freedom was right there. But the boy no longer had the strength to even reach for it anymore. The boy shivered, vision darkening as they accepted their fate. The boy asked for forgiveness from any god that would listen as he closed his eyes and let out what he felt would be his last breath. "Would you really take my hand so easily, young man?" The boy opened his eyes, but at the same time, he didn't. He looked around at the sudden monochrome of his surroundings, one of the guards frozen mid-turn. Then he looked at the tall, void black shape that stood in front of him. The boy smiled with relief as he spoke for the first time in months. "I have failed my people. It is only correct that I atone." The void black shape remained silent for a moment, before sighing and taking form. A boy no older than the one in chains softly sat on the cold stone floor, cloak parting to reveal prosthetic legs and a t-shirt with ribcage print. The Reaper shook their heads sadly. "You did not fail my child. You were deceived and betrayed. All of you were." The boy remained silent, head bowed in resignation. Death looked on the boy with pity, studying the infected wounds and dried blood that covered them. The Reaper showed no more emotion as he looked at the chains that fettered the teenager. Death then gazed at the hourglass in his palm. The top was empty. He should be guiding the boy to the afterlife by now. But Death had been a human once as well, and as he looked at the boy across from him, his cold heart stirred. "Your body and mind may be broken, my child, but I feel your spirit still has strength. Rise from this place unbroken." The Reaper crushed the hourglass in his palm. There was a flash of light and the shackles around the boy's wrists, ankles and neck came loose. The Reaper stood, beginning to fade away. "What is your name, child?" The boy's soul spoke, glowing as it did. "My name is Drake." The Reaper smiled and he was gone. The cell door rattled open, and one of the Genosian guards made a sound of disgust. "Ugh, it's already half rotten. These things take forever to die." Drake remained still, eyes closed, waiting. "We still gotta haul the corpse out. Don't want the entire place smelling of rotten livestock." A gauntleted metal hand grabbed the chain attached to Drake's collar and paused. "Where's the lock?" Drake took his chance as he ripped an arm free from its shackle. He grabbed the Geknosian's unstrapped sidearm and pulled it from the holster like a bolt of lightning. A smile tugged on the infected cut across Drake's face as he pressed the muzzle against the Geknosian's plain metal faceplate. Drake took a deep breath and grinned malignantly at the stunned lizard. The lizard sputtered in disbelief. "You're still elite!" Drake pressed the trigger stud, and the laser pistol flashed blindingly as a hole was burnt completely through the Genosian's head and helmet. Without missing a beat, Drake turned the blaster on the other guard. Caught by surprise, the guard barely registered Drake's manic, soulless grin as his heart was turned to steam. He slumped over, gasping and clawing at the ground until he fell still, purple blood pooling from beneath the armor. Drake slowly, painfully got to his feet and stumbled to the open cell door. He listened carefully, body begging for food and rest. But he didn't hear any more guards for the time being. He glanced back at the guard's armor, then placed his foot against the bottom of one of the dead guard's boots. "I should be able to fit." The power-armored figure clomped steadily through the halls of the arena, cutting through the milling drunk of the highborn and their personal guard. The figure seemed twitchy, a hand hovering near the lost pistol on their side. The armor's articulated tail dragged limply, like the operator had been born tailless, and in truth, they had. A cold fire burned in Drake's chest as he marched through the crowded halls. Each step sent pain shooting through his body from various infected wounds. But Drake wasn't done yet. So long as he could draw breath, he'd make sure the promises made to his people were kept. The Geknosian power armor fit poorly, clearly designed for non-human anatomy. Drake made to take another step, but didn't fully lift his foot up before leaning forward. He came crashing down face first. The intoxicated nobles and oligarchs laughed, and the boy felt his rage flare. But he couldn't afford to be rash. They'd all get what was coming to them eventually. Drake slowly clambered to his feet, continuing to march toward the fighter pits. They hadn't blindfolded him when they brought him in, a mistake on their part. Drake's shattered thoughts continued to wander, as exhaustion and pain drew him into autopilot. He remembered the little Clouville girl that lived next door. The little loaves of bread she baked. You'll come back to us, right? Drake had to stop for a moment as the memory punched him in the gut. He'd offered himself up for the pits in her father's stead. Normally, Drake would have been too young for the fighting pits, not even being 18 solar cycles old. But he was also an orphan, his parents having died trying to defend their home city. Drake felt it was his duty to volunteer for the arena, and now his duty had changed. The hallways became wider and less crowded as Drake made his way deeper into the arena's bowels, until he reached a large, intricately carved wooden door flanked by 2 guards. He looked up at the design on the door and felt his blood boil. A depiction of the monarch stood triumphantly upon a mountain of human and Clouville corpses, flag planted in a skull far too small to be an adult. Drake took a labored step forward, heart beating in his ears as his thoughts turned to violence. Remember this, parasites. If you somehow defeat the warrior you're faced with, you'll have earned your and your village's freedom, as decreed by our glorious monarch divine. Liars, Drake growled as he took a heavy step towards the guards, catching their attention. Deceivers! He barked, making one guard flinch and unsling their Gauss rifle. The other guard cautiously approached Drake, thinking it was one of his comrades after too much liquor. Drake locked onto the lizard who'd pulled their helmet off and began to speak. Are you all right, Private? Do you need to lay When the lizard was within arm's reach, Drake's hand shot out with no warning and grabbed the guard by the throat with his powered gauntlet. It was Drake's turn to speak as the lizard's purplish face began to darken as he choked and clawed at the fingers digging into his throat. I'm gonna kill you all! Drake twisted his wrist and the Geknosian's neck snapped, their body going limp as their eyes swiveled wildly for a moment. Drake tossed the dying Geknosian to the side and sprinted at the other one who'd moved to block the doorway. Drake screamed. A primal, unhinged, inhuman sound as a Gauss slug pinged off his helmet. He didn't stop his charge when he felt his shoulder slam into the Geknosian. He didn't stop as he felt the Geknosian get pinned to the door, the wood creaking. He didn't stop even as he felt the Geknosian's armor buckling under the force. He only stopped when he burst through the wooden doors. Splinters and timber mixed with purple blood, and broken armor exploded into the slaves' barracks, and 100 hopeless eyes turned to the figure in blood-stained armor that now stood in the broken doorway. Drake's blood boiled as he saw the hundreds of hopeless eyes that stared at him from cages and shackled to the wall. The cages were packed haphazardly and with no sense of organization. The strong and able were caged with the sick and weak. Almost every cage had a corpse in it, wooden signs with Geknosian script nailed into their rotting flesh. The only good parasite. Drake felt something break inside of him and he slowly reached up, removing his power armor's helmet as his fury went from a white-hot furnace to a tiny pinprick. But that little pinprick of heat threatened to consume him as he mindlessly marched up to the closest cage and ripped the door off with his power armor's inhuman strength. He spoke in a voice no louder than a whisper, but it was a whisper that brought life to dead eyes. They're going to pay for this. They're all going to pay for this. Drake looked at the shattered door, then at the racks of medieval weaponry on the far wall. And their suffering will be tenfold what they inflicted on us. Guayarva sat at the head of the lush banquet table. The arena owner and minor royalty laughed jovially as his goblet was refilled. He gazed on happily as nobility and oligarchy dined their fill of the parasite's cuisine. He'd even adopted their medieval culture for his jurisdiction. The fat lizard drained his goblet and motioned for another from the parasite woman in chains beside him. He watched with sick glee as the malnourished female parasite tipped the jug with dead eyes. Guayarva took pleasure in how well he treated his parasites. He gave them food, shelter, clothing, all from the goodness of his heart. Feeling especially generous, Guayarva picked up a leg of poultry and threw it on the ground, watching with glee as his 2 parasite servants rabidly dove for it, fighting each other tooth and nail for the small piece of nourishment. Guayarva broke into applause as his wine servant clubbed the other with the mostly empty jug, leaving the other unmoving as they savagely tore into the meat. Suddenly, the massive double doors burst open. A heavily injured Geknosian holding a Gauss rifle and wearing the tattered remains of a court jester's outfit burst in, crying out. My lord, the parasites have escaped. They're armed and they're heading this way. The jester suddenly pitched forward with a sickening noise, a dagger buried to the hilt in the back of their skull. The entire gathering froze, looking at the dead jester in shock and disbelief, the sounds of violent fighting reaching them through the open doors. Guayarva was just about to reassure everyone that everything would be fine, raising his arms to show off his grand robe. But he stopped, staring at the doorway in pale-faced shock. The human had shoulder-length black greasy hair. An infected cut across their face oozed black blood and pus, in stark contrast to the manic smile filled with broken teeth. Poorly fitting Ganosian power armor hung from the sallow boy's frame. A leaf-bladed bastard sword was held low in their right hand, blade dripping blood. A small, one-handed axe was clutched in their left, head covered in gore, much like the human. The bastard sword was raised and pointed straight at Guayarva as the human spoke in a ragged voice. "I won. I earned mine and my people's freedom. Give it to me!" Guayarva felt his temper flare at being addressed so rudely. He swung his arm wide across his chest in a grand gesture and shouted, "You think you earned your freedom, you parasite? That whole thing was a lie to make the fights more entertaining. We never expected one of you dirty creatures to win." Guayarva sneered at the blank-faced human as the obese lizard rose to his feet and waddled around the table, continuing to speak. "Your entire species has us to thank for not wiping you out on the first place. You should be grateful. But no, you're here whining about your precious freedom. Lower life forms, like you don't deserve the air you breathe. Get out of my sight now, you filthy gutter rat." The fat lizard smugly watched the human drop their weapons. But the next thing he knew, he was on the ground and his face hurt. Guayarva looked up, dumbfounded as the human grabbed a fistful of his ornate robes and drew their fist back again. "We should be grateful?" Wham! The human hit the fat lizard hard, making blood gush from Guayarva's nose. The fat lizard whimpered as the human brought back their fist, begging, "Please, I'm sorry, don't hit me Wham! The human began to shout. "What? Sorry for what? Sending 1,000 off to die for entertainment? Working millions to death in uranium mines? Stuffing yourself like a fat pig while we starve?" Each shouted question was punctuated with a punch so hard it broke bones and split scales. Guayarva blubbered and whimpered for his life as the human threw him to the ground, eyes swollen shut. There was silence for a moment as Guayarva begged blindly. The lower royalty tried to crawl away thinking the human had left. But he didn't get far until he felt a heavy metal knee in his back and a serrated blade press into his throat scales. The human's voice was like ice as the blade was pressed into Guayarva's throat. "Now be a good piggy and die squealing." Guayarva felt the blade get dragged across his throat, pain blossoming and quickly fading as he began to feel lightheaded. Arduously, he rolled over, eyes unswelling just enough to see the boy's blank smile and the towering cloaked figure behind them. Drake watched the light fade from the arena master's eyes, the small nuclear sun in his chest cooling slightly as he turned slowly towards the frozen lower nobles and oligarchs, then at their captive servants as the humans from the pits finally began showing up. Finally, he approached a young woman whose chains were held in a death grip by an old, gray-scaled Geknosian. He pressed the knife into her palm, and she looked up, eyes starting to clear as he gave her a warm smile. "Freedom is only a cutaway." The woman took the knife as the wealthy and powerful Geknosians suddenly became even more fearful. Some even quietly begged their servants to spare them. Drake just nodded to the other servants as he felt the exhaustion start to overtake him. He took a seat on the arena master's ornate chair, staring down at the Geknosians who looked all but powerless now. Drake slowly let his eyes close as the sound of rending flesh and drowned screams filled the ornate dining hall. Drake felt a great weight disappear from his shoulders, but a new one building in his chest. He'd liked making the arena master suffer, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Drake sat in the arena master's personal office, reading through financial and logistical paperwork. A Clouville doctor who was previously under indenture was disinfecting and bandaging the puncture in Drake's hand. The boy set a guard rotation schedule down and cracked his neck before turning to watch as the doctor pulled the bandage's knot tight. Drake inspected the doctor's handiwork and nodded, letting the man leave. Drake just sighed as he stood, feeling the stitches running across his face and grinning slightly. The odds were against him, even more so after he let the rest of the newly freed slaves return to their homes. Drake walked slowly through the halls of the now empty arena, the smell of blood lingering in the air. He'd been lucky that the place wasn't having any events scheduled for after his revolt. but he had come across something worrying in the arena master's desk. They'd been receiving a massive amount of items with redacted names for an experiment. The project's name wasn't easily translatable, but it was a reference to a brutal Geknosian myth about some kind of mechanical beast. The keycard in his hand had been attached to the document. He hoped it was some kind of key. Following the small plaques that indicated the directions of various facilities, Drake felt out of place. Geknosians, on average, stood head and shoulders above a normal human. The fact he had to step back to read some of the plaques was evidence of this. The plain wooden walls gave way to a sterile, white Durasteel corridor after Drake took a turn. The boy froze, glaring at the large drop-down door at the end of the hall. But, steeling his nerves, he marched forward and inserted the keycard into the reader. The door shook and then slid upwards with a clatter as the lights in the room turned on. Drake felt his mind go numb as he saw what the experiment was. Corpses in various stages of cybernetic augmentation adorned what looked like autopsy tables. Organs spilling from skin that had been peeled and stretched open. Arms, legs, even a severed head were in clear vessels that were plugged into a machine on the far wall. But what has stopped Drake in his tracks was the remains of a human that had been strapped to an odd vertical slab. A vaguely head-shaped lump of machinery was grafted to the neck. Both arms had been replaced with cybernetics that seemed to have fused with the skin. Metal and cybernetics replaced everything from the human's liver down. The worst part? The machine and man combination slowly lifted their machine, mechanical jaw opening wide. "Please." The thing's voice was pitiful, weak, begging. "Please, it hurts." Drake stepped forward, mind numb, body burning with rage. Not at the poor person before him, but the twisted minds that had inflicted this torture. "Please, I can't see." Drake gently touched the thing's metal cheek, achieving no reaction. Drake gently drew the thing into a hug, pressing his chest against what was left of theirs as he grabbed the cable leading into the head. The voice dropped to a whisper. "Please, kill me." Drake didn't respond as he ripped the cable from the thing's head. Feeling it go limp, Drake turned to leave, unable to look anymore. But he stopped once more, feeling his sanity about to shatter. The head inside of the clear vessels was staring at him with an expression he could only describe as confused horror. Drake felt numb as he watched the head blink twice and then try to look down, but only the eyes moved. Drake slowly shuffled over to the vessel, something roaring in his ears as he pressed a hand against the glass. The person's head inside screamed silently, mouth falling slackly open. "I'll find who did this to you," Drake mumbled, drawing the lost pistol he'd stolen from his cell guards. "And I'll make them suffer. I'll make them all suffer as you have." Drake pressed the emitter against the glass, closed his eyes, and turned his head before pressing the trigger stud. His vision blurred as rage, grief, and revulsion warred inside of him. But then they were all overwhelmed by one emotion. One that burned hotter than the center of a sun. A hatred that would bring empires to their knees and put tyrants to the sword.